Lesson 4. Gun Regulation and Canadian Youths. Controlling access to firearms has been a concern of governments for hundreds of years. Firearms have greater lethality than most other weapons and thus have greater potential to harm and kill. Guns have also the potential to be used by citizens against their own state, and so controlling access to guns is also linked to national security. Witness the decades-long debate in the United States about the right to possess and carry arms by citizens as a right under their Constitution. Those famous words, "a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." What does this amendment to the American Constitution say and mean? Does it mean the right of individual people to possess and use arms, or does it mean a collective right of citizens to bear arms in a militia to protect their country? Legal opinions often hinged with political ideas about the nature and role of government and how they shape people's lives. My own interpretation is that the Second Amendment applies to the collective right to bear arms, not an individual right, but that is neither here nor there, as I am not an American. Many other nations have struggled over the principle of how to regulate access to firearms. One of my current research projects examines gun control in 19th century Ireland. At the time, Ireland was joined with Great Britain into the United Kingdom, and as such, the Parliament in Westminster legislated for both Ireland and England. One of the interesting things is that though the two countries were united into a single kingdom, and both were considered to be equal, there were very stringent firearms regulations in Ireland, but virtually none in Britain. Much of this had to do with the perceived lawlessness of Ireland. It also had to do, I argue, with the fact that Ireland was over 80% Catholic during the 19th century, and successive British governments viewed the Catholic population with suspicion as being potentially disloyal. Indeed, as late as 1843, the English government interpreted the law of the land as barring poor Catholics from illegally being able to possess guns. In this article by Blake, we see a different inquiry, looking at the connection of male youth culture in turn-of-the-century Canada with firearms regulations. One of the key elements here was a growing concern about the nature of young men in Canada, their pastimes, their manliness, and their place in the greater British Empire. Youths using guns was linked to manly pastimes like hunting, drilling, and interest in the outdoors. During the period from the later 19th century into the first couple of decades of the 20th century, there was great concern about the changing nature of Canadian society. Part of the context of this growing anxiety was concern about the growing urbanization of Canada, that is, concern with more Canadians moving to and growing up in towns and cities, and how this would shape young Canadians. Would youths in towns and cities learn the proper masculine skills and habits of the country-born and country-living peers who grew up with rifles on their farms to control pests and vermin? Or would they succumb to what was viewed as the potential degrading effects of urban life, which was seen either as a feminizing influence on young men on the one hand, or the debasing of young men on the other? Urban life threatened to erode the manly nature of young men, and also threatened to erode their values, and perhaps lead them into lives of crime and immorality. As we will see in other lectures and readings, cities were suspect because those living in them were freer from the traditional family and community networks that regulated public behavior. It was much easier to be anonymous in a city than in a rural village. This was particularly worrying for those concerned about regulating the sexuality of young women in particular. With these fears of the effects of urbanization and changing culture on young men, groups and even governments promoted the familiarity with and use of firearms by young men. Sam Hughes, the Canadian Minister for the Militia during World War I, commented that wherever you have a strong military spirit, you have more manhood in the youth of the country. Along with the growth of movements such as the Cadets, which were funded by the federal government and supplied with rifles, was the market-driven factor of mass production of firearms, which made them much more affordable and accessible. Historians usually point to the American Civil War as being a large factor here, as during the war there was huge firearm production to equip the Union and Confederate armies during the early 1860s. When the war ended, the arms manufacturers sought new markets to sell their now cheaper made guns. Boys and young men in the USA and Canada were the perfect market for this. In Canada, there was generally lax regulation of firearms before 1892. An 1877 act barred carrying of pistols without reasonable fear of safety to person, family, or property, which seems pretty vague. In 1892, an age limit for pistols was introduced. A factor here was the mass production of revolvers such as Colts, which had greater fire and killing power, along with the ability to fire many bullets before having to reload ammunition. Thus, in 1892, the Canadian government introduced a minimum age for access to pistols. It became illegal to buy or to give as a gift a pistol to someone under the age of 16. Age limits were part of the greater regulation of society by governments, including restrictions on when youths could leave school, when they could legally work, and even minimum age for legal sexual relations. According to Blake, the new law created a demarcation line between youth and adulthood that sought to prevent the use of pistols by reckless young people. As with looking at any legislation, the omissions and restrictions of firearms regulations from 1892 say as much as what was in the law. One could not sell or give a pistol to someone under 16, but this did not mean that you could not lend a youth a pistol. The idea here would seem to be that youths could use pistols under the supervision of parents or other organizations, though this was not explicitly stated in the legislation. While pistols were regulated, the sale and possession of rifles to youths were not. While both were potentially dangerous firearms, they each symbolized different things. Pistols were linked to concealment, crimes in cities, and thus not as openly manly weapons. Rifles, on the other hand, are difficult to conceal. They are out in the open, and were associated with the positive pastime of hunting, life in the outdoors, and the military, that is, defense of the country, and even the interests of the British Empire. The 1913 federal legislation added new controls to the access of firearms. It made it illegal to sell or give any kind of firearm to someone under the age of 16, thus including rifles. Again, as Blake points out, there were large loopholes in the legislation. You could not sell or give a firearm to a youth, but youths were not barred from possessing them. The likely intention of the legislation was thus that firearms would be used under the supervision of parents or some organization who could lend guns for youth to use. The implication would thereby be that the gun is the property and therefore responsibility of the parent or group, and they would be responsible for what youths did with the guns. In the early 20th century, there was concern about youths having access to guns. However, there was one more element to consider when looking at firearms regulation in Canada at the time, and this was the fear caused by increased immigration to Canadian cities from parts of Europe. In the first decade of the 20th century was witnessed large increase in immigration to Canada, with especially fear and prejudice against certain groups, particularly those coming from southern and eastern Europe, where the good kind of immigration had been from northern and western Europe, from the British Isles, from Germany, from Holland, Scandinavia, and so on. Stereotypes that especially people from southern Europe, Greeks, Italians, and so on, stereotypes that they were quick to temper, that they were volatile people who would be quick to resolve disputes, raised questions about new immigrant groups living in cities and the access to firearms, particularly using pistols. Thus, as Blake points out, provincial legislation often required record-keeping of when immigrants or foreigners were found with illegal gun possession, that the information should be used in bringing about the deportation process.